Before you read this amazing true story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you don't miss any of our emotional stories. Your support means the world to us, and we love sharing these incredible real-life moments with people like you. Now, let's begin this remarkable tale. The sun was shining brightly over the cobblestone streets of central London on a crisp autumn morning. It was one of those days where the weather felt perfect, and the city was bustling with tourists and locals going about their daily business. Among the crowd of visitors standing near the gates of one of London's most famous palaces stood a group of school children on an educational tour. They were pointing at the grand stone buildings and taking photographs, chattering excitedly about the history they were learning that day. One of these children was Prince George, who was accompanying his school on a special educational visit. Unlike most days, he wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or special security that would immediately give away his identity. He was dressed simply in his school uniform, blending in with the other students as much as a young prince could. His teachers had arranged this visit specifically so the children could experience history in a real and meaningful way. Away from the usual ceremonial settings, the royal guards stood in their iconic positions, dressed in their striking scarlet tunics and tall bearskin hats. They were there to maintain order and protect the buildings, as they had for generations. Most tourists knew that the guards were instructed to remain absolutely still, no matter what happened around them. It was part of the tradition and the job that these men took very seriously. They trained for months to perfect their bearing and ability to stand motionless for hours at a time. However, on this particular morning, something unusual was happening. One of the guards, a younger man named James, who had only been in the position for a few months, was experiencing something that would shake his confidence and test his patience. A group of teenagers who weren't part of any official tours had positioned themselves right in front of him. They were laughing loudly and making faces at him, trying to get a reaction. James was trained to ignore such behavior. But what started as simple teasing quickly escalated into something much more serious. The teenagers were mocking his uniform, making jokes about his appearance, and calling him names. They were filming him on their phones, clearly hoping to capture a moment where he might break character or react emotionally. Some of the other tourists were watching the situation with discomfort, but many just walked by, not wanting to get involved. What made the situation even harder for James was that no one was stopping them. The teenagers felt emboldened by the lack of consequences. They moved closer to him, their taunts becoming louder and more aggressive. They were pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable behavior, testing to see just how much they could do before someone stopped them. The atmosphere had shifted from playful to genuinely hurtful and disrespectful. James's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of the emotional toll this was taking on him. His eyes, which should have been looking straight ahead, seemed to glaze over slightly as he tried to disconnect from what was happening. But inside, his heart was racing. He was trained for many things, but nothing quite prepared you for the feeling of being publicly humiliated and mocked. Unable to defend yourself or walk away. The other guards nearby were aware of what was happening. But by tradition, they couldn't intervene unless there was actual physical danger. They stood at their posts, powerless to help their colleague. Some of the adult tourists were shaking their heads disapprovingly at the teenagers' behavior, but they remained silent, not wanting to cause a scene themselves. It was at this moment, in the midst of this uncomfortable situation, that someone unexpected stepped forward. Prince George, the young schoolboy who was just trying to enjoy his educational day with his classmates, noticed what was happening. He had been standing back, observing the situation, along with a few other students from his group. His teachers were focused on pointing out architectural details to another group of children, so they hadn't noticed the conflict developing nearby. The young prince watched as the teenagers continued their harassment. He saw the guards' discomfort, even though the man was doing everything in his power to hide it. He recognized something in that moment that many adults around him had failed to see: that standing and taking abuse, no matter how trained you were to do so, was not something anyone should have to endure alone. George had been raised with strong values about kindness, respect, and standing up for what was right. His family had taught him that real strength wasn't about power or position, but about doing the right thing when it mattered most. He understood that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was to speak up. Even when it was uncomfortable or difficult, the young prince took a deep breath and started to walk toward the guard and the group of teenagers. His friends, still huddled with the tour group, watched him with confusion. What was he doing? Where was he going? They had no idea that they were about to witness something that would stay with them forever. A moment that would teach them about courage, compassion, and the unexpected power of one person choosing to do the right thing. George walked with purpose, his young face set with determination. He was still just a boy, younger than the teenagers who were doing the bullying, and certainly smaller in size. But what he lacked in physical presence, he made up for with genuine conviction. His classmates started noticing his movement and began paying attention to what was unfolding before them. As George approached the group, the teenagers initially didn't notice him. They were too caught up in their own amusement, too focused on getting reactions and recording videos to share with their friends online. But when the young prince stood directly in front of them, they finally paused and looked down at him. There was something about his calm, respectful demeanor that immediately changed the energy of the moment. George looked up at them with eyes that held no anger, only disappointment mixed with a quiet kind of strength. He didn't yell or threaten them. He didn't call them names or match their aggressive energy. Instead, he spoke clearly and firmly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed much older than his years. He told them that they were being cruel, that they were making fun of someone who was just doing his job, someone who hadn't done anything to deserve their treatment. The teenagers were taken aback. They hadn't expected to be confronted, especially not by someone so young. And they certainly hadn't expected to be made to feel ashamed through words spoken so gently yet so powerfully. There was no aggression in George's tone, just honest truth about how their actions were affecting another person. It was the kind of confrontation that doesn't rely on being loud or aggressive, but on being right and kind at the same time. As George spoke, some of the surrounding adults began to pay closer attention. A few tourists stopped and turned to watch. Some of the other school children from George's group had gathered to see what he was doing. Teachers who had been focused on their tour groups began to notice that something significant was happening near the guard post. The teenagers' expressions began to change. One of them looked genuinely uncomfortable, as if maybe they hadn't really thought about what they were doing from the guard's perspective. Another seemed to be reflecting on how they would feel if they were the ones being treated this way. George's words were hitting a mark that stern warnings from adults often cannot reach, perhaps because his perspective came without judgment, without authority thrown around. Just pure human empathy. George took a step closer and asked them a simple question. Did they think their behavior was making anyone's day better? Did they believe that what they were doing was something they could be proud of? He pointed out that the guard was a real person, someone who had a family, someone who had chosen to serve in this position, and someone who deserved basic respect and dignity. The impact of this interaction was visible in the faces of the teenagers. Their phones had been lowered. The mocking expressions had faded. One of them actually apologized, not just to George, but to the guard directly. They said they hadn't thought about it that way before. Another admitted that they felt bad about what they were doing, that they had just been trying to be cool in front of their friends, and it had gone too far. What George had accomplished in just a few minutes was remarkable. He hadn't used threats or authority. He hadn't called for security or made a big scene that would have made everything worse. He had simply treated the teenagers with enough respect that they began to reconsider their actions from a place of genuine conscience. He had appealed to their better selves, and it had worked. The group of teenagers eventually moved away from the guard post, still seeming a bit embarrassed about what had transpired. But the change in their demeanor was noticeable. They weren't laughing anymore, and they seemed to be actually talking to each other about what had just happened, perhaps reflecting on their behavior in a real way. At the guard post, James stood in his rigid position, but his eyes had changed. They now held a glimmer of something new: gratitude, surprise, and a deep sense of being seen and defended when he couldn't defend himself. Even though his posture remained unchanged, his internal experience had been transformed by a simple act of kindness and bravery from a young person he had never met before. The other guards had noticed everything that happened. Word would spread among them about how a young schoolboy had shown more courage and wisdom than many grown adults displayed in similar situations. They would talk about it in the barracks. About how sometimes the most powerful defense against cruelty isn't physical force, but simple, honest compassion and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when doing so makes you vulnerable. After the teenagers had moved away, George turned his attention back to the guard. He realized something that many people in similar situations often overlook. Standing up for someone is important, but checking in on them afterward matters too. George approached the guard respectfully, aware that he couldn't speak to him while the guard was on duty in his official position. But he wanted to acknowledge what had happened. George waited until a senior officer came to relieve the guard for a brief break a few minutes later. This was part of the regular rotation, and it gave James an opportunity to step away from his post for a short time. George approached him carefully, still showing the respect that the uniform demanded. When James saw the young boy waiting for him, he immediately felt a wave of emotion. He wasn't expecting this follow-up. He wasn't expecting to be thanked or acknowledged. For James, who had been standing there feeling humiliated and powerless, this moment of recognition from the young person who had defended him felt like a turning point. It transformed what could have been a day that left him questioning his choice of profession into something meaningful. George introduced himself properly, and asked James if he was okay. He asked how long he had been enduring the teenager's behavior and whether incidents like this happened often. The questions weren't casual or superficial. They came from a genuine place of concern, the kind of concern that showed James that someone had truly seen his struggle and was taking it seriously. James, who had been trained to be stoic and composed, found himself getting emotional. He explained that yes, unfortunately, situations like this did happen from time to time. He said that most people didn't realize how difficult it was to stand there, unable to react, unable to walk away, unable to defend yourself. He described the psychological toll of being publicly disrespected while having to maintain an appearance of indifference. But he also shared that in his few months on the job, he had never experienced a situation where someone his age, or even younger, had stood up for him like George had done. The conversation between the young prince and the guard became a moment of genuine human connection. George listened intently as James talked about why he had taken this job. James explained that he came from a military family, that he believed in service and tradition, and that most days he felt proud to stand there representing his country's history and institutions. But days like today made him question whether the job was worth the emotional cost. George then shared something with James that would stay with the guard for the rest of his life. He told James that what he did mattered, explained that the guard's presence, his dedication to standing firm despite discomfort and disrespect, is a symbol of something bigger than just himself. He said that the guard's commitment to duty, even on difficult days, was a form of quiet strength that deserved recognition and respect. This perspective, coming from someone so young, seemed to shift something in James's understanding of his role. He realized that perhaps he had been too focused on the negative aspects of the difficult days and hadn't fully appreciated the value of what he was doing. George's words served as a reminder that there were people who saw him, who appreciated his service, and who believed in the importance of what he was doing. Other teachers and tourists had begun to notice the interaction between George and James. What had started as a confrontation about bullying had evolved into something more profound, a meaningful conversation about respect, service, and the importance of acknowledging those who serve in ways that often go unnoticed or underappreciated. Before it was time for James to return to his post, George did something simple but profound. He stood at attention, the way he had learned in his own training, and gave James a formal, respectful nod of acknowledgement. It was a gesture that conveyed deep respect and gratitude. James, for his part, allowed the smallest smile to cross his face, something that would have been against protocol just moments earlier, but in this instance felt entirely appropriate. As George walked back to rejoin his school group, James returned to his post with a noticeably different energy. Yes, his posture was the same. Yes, his uniform was the same. But something internal had changed. He stood taller, metaphorically speaking. He felt seen, acknowledged, and valued in a way that the difficulties of the day could no longer diminish. The other guards working nearby had observed this entire exchange. They exchanged knowing glances with each other. None of them had expected the day to unfold in this way. They had thought it would be another typical day with the usual challenges that came with the job. Instead, they had witnessed something that reminded them all why they did what they did, and how a single act of kindness and courage could change everything about how a difficult day is remembered and processed. News of the incident traveled through the palace staff and security teams much faster than anyone might have expected. By the end of the day, senior officials had heard the story of how a young schoolboy had defended one of their guards against bullying, and had then taken time to check on the guard's well-being. The story resonated with everyone who heard it because it highlighted something that gets lost in the routines and protocols of institutional life: the importance of basic human kindness in standing up for others. Within a few days, the incident had reached higher levels of leadership. The palace's security director requested a formal meeting with the guard to hear the full story from his perspective. James recounted everything that had happened, including the young boy's intervention and the meaningful conversation that had followed. The director listened carefully, understanding that what the guard was describing wasn't just an anecdote, but a powerful example of character and courage, demonstrated by someone very young. The story also reached George's school, as his teachers had been present during the incident and naturally discussed it with administrators and other staff members. His teachers spoke of how impressed they were by his instinctive response to the situation, his natural sense of justice, and his ability to handle a potentially volatile situation with intelligence and kindness. They noted that George hadn't boasted about what he had done or sought any kind of recognition. He had simply done what he felt was right and moved on with his day. James's commanding officers decided to acknowledge what had happened in a formal way. They wanted to send a message to the guard that his difficult experience had been recognized and that the young person's intervention was being taken seriously, as an example of the kind of moral courage that society needed more of. They also wanted James to know that his commitment to duty, even in the face of disrespect, had not gone unnoticed. A few weeks after the incident, James received a commendation from his superiors. It wasn't given for any military achievement or perfect performance of his duties, but rather for having shown the resilience and dignity to continue doing his job with integrity even when being publicly disrespected. The commendation acknowledged that he had passed a difficult test with grace. In a way, the commendation was also an indirect recognition of the young person's intervention, acknowledging that what George had done mattered and had made a tangible difference in the life of a person he didn't even know. The incident also sparked a broader conversation among the palace staff about workplace dignity and the psychological impact of public disrespect. It led to some new protocols being implemented to better protect guards and other staff members from harassment while they were performing their duties. Palace officials reached out to local schools about teaching young people about respect for those in service positions and about the importance of treating all people with basic human dignity. James found that in the weeks following the incident, something had shifted within him. He felt renewed in his commitment to his position. He understood now that there were people who recognized the value of what he was doing, even if some people didn't. The next time a situation arose where tourists were being disruptive or disrespectful, he handled it with even more patience and calm. Knowing that his quiet dignity in the face of challenge had real power, George, meanwhile, had returned to his normal school life. His classmates who had witnessed his intervention treated him with a new kind of respect. But George himself didn't seem to want to make a big deal about what had happened. When asked about it, he simply said that he had noticed someone being treated unfairly and that it seemed like the right thing to do to speak up about it. He wasn't trying to be a hero or gain attention. He was simply following his conscience. The incident became talked about in George's family circles as well. People who heard about what he had done were impressed not by any dramatic heroics, but by the simple, direct way he had addressed injustice. It demonstrated a kind of moral intelligence that can't be taught in a classroom, but grows from values that are lived and modeled over time. What had started as an ordinary day at the palace had become something more significant. A bullying incident that could have been forgotten or dismissed had instead become a catalyst for positive change and reflection. The guard had learned that his work mattered. The young prince had demonstrated that courage and kindness were more powerful than physical strength or social status. And everyone who had witnessed or heard about the incident had been reminded of an important truth, that standing up for what is right, especially when it requires vulnerability, is always worth doing. Months passed since that fateful day at the palace. James continued his work as a royal guard, but something had fundamentally changed in how he approached his role. He stood at his post, not with grim determination, but with a sense of purpose that felt more meaningful. He understood now that the people who came to the palace represented a wide spectrum of humanity, and that his presence there helped maintain not just physical order, but also a sense of dignity and respect for the institution. One afternoon, as James was standing at his regular post, he received an unexpected visitor. George, accompanied by his school group on another educational tour, had come back to the palace. This time, George made sure to acknowledge James when they passed by. It was a brief moment, just a nod and a smile. But it carried the weight of their previous encounter and the bond that had formed between them. James felt deeply moved by this small gesture. The fact that George had remembered him, that the young person had taken time to acknowledge him again, meant more than James could easily put into words. It was a reminder that their interaction hadn't been a one-time occurrence, but had created a lasting connection between two people from very different circumstances. This second encounter also served as a turning point in how James viewed his future. He had been considering leaving the service, finding a job that felt less emotionally taxing. But after seeing George again, and remembering how much their first conversation had affected him, James made the decision to stay. He recommitted himself to his role, but now with a deeper understanding of why the work mattered, beyond the immediate impact on James. The incident had influenced how George thought about the world. The young prince had learned that age and size didn't determine a person's ability to make a difference. He had discovered that speaking up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable or risky, could genuinely help another person. This lesson would shape his character for years to come, influencing how he approached other situations where he witnessed unfairness or cruelty. In George's school, the incident became a teaching moment, though not in an explicit way. Teachers used the experience to open discussions about empathy, respect, and the importance of standing up for what is right. Students began to think more carefully about how their actions affected others, particularly those in service roles who weren't always treated with the dignity they deserved. The story inspired other young people to be more mindful of those around them. Word of the incident eventually reached media outlets. Though George's family asked for privacy regarding the details, nevertheless, the basic story became known. A young schoolboy had intervened when a guard was being bullied, had then checked on the guard's well-being. The story resonated with the public because it represented something increasingly rare in the modern world: a young person choosing to do the right thing simply because it was right. Without seeking recognition or reward, social media, despite its reputation for negativity, became a platform where the story inspired countless people. Parents shared it with their children as an example of the kind of character they wanted their kids to develop. Teachers used it as a springboard for classroom discussions about kindness and courage. The incident showed that in a world often focused on conflict and division, there were still people, even young people, choosing compassion and integrity. For James, the recognition that came from the incident was gratifying. But what mattered most was the internal shift it created. He stopped viewing his job as something he had to endure and started seeing it as something meaningful. He understood that standing firm, maintaining dignity, and performing his duty with integrity, even when others didn't respect it, was a form of quiet power that had real value in the world. The two eventually became sort of unlikely friends, in the way that people from different worlds can connect through a single meaningful interaction. James would look forward to seeing George on school visits to the palace, even if they only exchanged brief acknowledgments. For George, James represented an example of someone who did important work that often went underappreciated, and he made a point of showing respect and recognition whenever they encountered each other. The incident also taught both of them something profound about the nature of human connection. It demonstrated that meaningful relationships don't always require long conversations or constant contact. Sometimes, they grow from a single moment of authentic human recognition and kindness, and they can have impacts that extend far beyond the two people involved. Several years later, after James had moved on to a different position within the palace security team, reflecting on his career and the path his life had taken, he would often think back to that one ordinary day that had become extraordinary. He had been promoted to a supervisory role where he was responsible for training and mentoring new guards. In this capacity, he made sure that every new recruit heard the story of what had happened that day and the lessons contained within it. James would tell the new guards that their job was about more than standing in formation or maintaining security protocols. Their presence represented something deeper: commitment to dignity, to service, and to maintaining standards that benefited the entire community. He would share how a single act of kindness from a young person had reminded him that the work he was doing mattered, and that difficult days were temporary, but the impact of maintaining one's integrity was lasting. When George was older and reflecting on his childhood experiences, he would remember that day with particular clarity. He realized that it had been one of the first times he had truly understood the power of individual choice and action. He had learned that you didn't need power or authority to make a difference. You just needed the courage to act according to your values. Even when doing so made you uncomfortable or vulnerable, George carried this lesson forward into his teenage years and beyond. He became known among his peers for his ability to stand up for those who were being treated unfairly, for his unwillingness to tolerate cruelty, and for his capacity to do so without being aggressive or mean-spirited. Friends noted that he had a particular empathy for people in service positions and for those whose work often went unrecognized or underappreciated. The incident also influenced how George thought about privilege and responsibility. He understood that having certain advantages in life came with an obligation to use those advantages on behalf of others, particularly those who didn't have the same access or platform. This understanding would shape many of his choices and decisions as he matured. Years later, when George was in university, he actually sought out James to reconnect more formally. James was surprised and deeply moved by this outreach. George explained that he had been thinking about how that interaction had affected him over the years, and that he wanted to tell James directly how grateful he was for the connection they had formed. More than that, George wanted to understand James's perspective on what had happened and how it had influenced his life. In this adult conversation between the two men who had first connected across a significant age and social gap, they exchanged perspectives that neither had fully shared before. James talked about how close he had come to leaving the service, about the depression and discouragement he had felt before George's intervention. He explained that George had quite possibly saved his career and his sense of purpose. George, in turn, shared how meaningful it had been to witness someone truly seeing him act on his values, and how much the impact had exceeded what he could have imagined at the time. Their conversation became a testament to the ripple effects of a single act of kindness and courage. What had seemed like a small intervention in the moment had actually been transformative for both of them. James had found renewed meaning in his work. George had been affirmed in his instinct to stand up for what was right. Their interaction had influenced many other people who heard about what happened, inspiring them to think differently about their own capacity to make a difference. The story of George and James spread further than either of them could have anticipated. It became an example used in schools, in training programs for public servants, and in discussions about character and courage. It showed that doing the right thing doesn't always require grand gestures or dramatic action. Sometimes it simply requires recognizing when someone is being treated unfairly and having the courage to say something, and then following up with genuine compassion and respect. The lesson of their story endures, because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature. We all want to be seen and valued for our contributions, no matter how humble our role might seem. We all need to know that someone cares about our well-being, and we all have the capacity to make a profound difference in someone else's life through simple acts of kindness, respect, and recognition. What began as an ordinary school visit to a famous palace, an incident of bullying, and a young person's instinctive response to injustice, became a story that mattered far beyond the two people directly involved. It became a reminder that character and courage can come from anywhere, regardless of age or status. It became a testament to the power of standing up for what is right, and to the profound impact that comes from truly seeing and respecting another person's struggle and their efforts to maintain their dignity in the face of difficulty. This is a story that will continue to inspire people long into the future.